Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show.
Today is the 75th anniversary of the National Day of Prayer. Here's Speaker Mike Johnson in Statuary Hall this morning highlighting our nation's founding and dependence on God Almighty.
100 feet or so here, if you went through the rotunda and took a left, and you would go down the hallway where my office is, the Speaker's office, on one side. On the other side is the Senate Majority Leader's office. And right in the middle of that is a chapel that was erected about the same time, built and established there about the same time as the National Day of Prayer became a formal piece of our law. And as you walk in there, many of you have been in there before. I invite you to go visit it. Your eyes will be drawn up to this beautiful original stained glass piece. It's one of a kind. I think it's the most beautiful I've ever seen. And in that stained glass, right in the center, is depicted the father of our country, George Washington. He is humbled before the Lord down on one knee. And he's praying, and it says the words surrounding him are from Psalm 16:1. And it says, "Preserve me, O God, for in thee do I put my trust." Preserve me. That's what the father of our country said. That's what we still echo today. And of course, that passage of Scripture is a restatement of our national motto, "In God we trust."
I think that is a wonderful tribute to both the National Day of Prayer and to our founding father, George Washington. And I think it is something that we all can remember as we are working to save this great country. I just got back from Alaska advocating for the passing of the SAVE Act. Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show. I'm Jenny Beth Martin. And yes, we went to Senator Lisa Murkowski's backyard because that's what you do when other actions don't work. You show up. And I wanted Murkowski to know the people who elected her are watching, and they're done waiting. And I wanted to let Senator Murkowski's constituents know their requests are not falling on deaf ears, and to do all I could to help amplify those voices. Here's where we are. The Save America Act passed the House. It is the most consequential election integrity legislation in our generation. And right now, the U.S. Senate is in recess, failing to continue the work to pass the Save America Act into law. Vacations and lack by some senators are standing in the way between the American people and secure elections, standing between you and knowing that your vote counts and that no non-citizens will be voting in our elections. I flew to Alaska because Senator Murkowski needs to hear from her constituents, not just from lobbyists and not just from other Senate colleagues. She needs to hear from the people who put her in that seat. So Scott Presler and I went. We organized, and we are not done. Now, Indiana just proved the grassroots pressure works. 6 Republican incumbents who blocked redistricting were defeated, replaced by Trump-backed challengers in a single election night. In one state on one night, 6 seats flipped. The election integrity movement must continue to exert the same energy towards the Save America Act. Here's the number to call. Write it down and call it 202-224-3121. Again, that's 202-224-3121. That is the Capitol switchboard. Call that number 2 times. Call and speak to each of your senators and tell them to pass the Save America Act. You can also go to passthesaveamericaact.com for more information and for more calls to action. Now, while Senate Republicans play politics with election integrity, President Trump just announced a new counterterrorism strategy that changes the entire framework of how we fight terrorism. And for the first time in history, it names what we've known for years. Cartels are killing more Americans than al-Qaeda. Open borders are a national security crisis. Ken Cuccinelli and Rod Martin are joining me today. Ken is the chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative. He's also the former Attorney General for Virginia and former acting Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And Rod Martin is a political commentator. He is the founder and chief executive of Martin Capital. Ken and Rod, it's so good to have you with me. Thanks for joining today.
Good to be with you.
Great to be here.
So yesterday, President Trump signed the 2026 National Counterterrorism Strategy. And the strategy declares, and I'm quoting this directly, "We will find you and we will kill you." Those are the exact words in a presidential national security document. The strategy elevates Western Hemisphere drug cartels above al-Qaeda and ISIS as a top counterterrorism threat to the United States. It names Antifa as a domestic terrorism threat for the first time in American history, and it prioritizes the southern border as a national security front. Rod, I want to start with you. The strategy elevates drug cartels above al-Qaeda and ISIS as counterterrorism priorities. From a national security standpoint, does this ranking reflect reality on the ground? And what does it actually mean for how resources will be allocated?
Oh, it absolutely does. And we're just kidding ourselves to think that the corruption we see in Mexico as a result of the cartels' enormous cash flows doesn't affect us on this side of the border. Why on earth would a cartel be stupid enough not to try to buy American judges and American police officers if they're in the business of doing that in Mexico anyway? So this is really important that we recognize that there's a corruption issue here. There is a violence issue here. And we have just been ignoring that, which makes you wonder if a Democratic Party that is so corrupt that it funds luring centers in Minnesota and through the taxpayers of Minnesota has become the top funder of al-Shabaab, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, wouldn't also be corrupt enough to wink and nod at the cartels here. But of course it goes beyond that, because the only domestic terrorism we've really ever had at scale in the United States has always been on the left. And we just spent 25 years pretending that that's not true. But whether you're talking about the Ku Klux Klan in 1866, or you're talking about Antifa and BLM more recently, or the Weather Underground in the 60s, or, oh wait, the Ku Klux Klan again now, funded by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It doesn't matter what era you look at. The true terrorism that we face in this country is domestic most of the time, and it's mostly coming from the Democrat Party.
Ken, you've spent your career at the intersection of law, national security, and the border. React to what Rod just laid out and also to what the president signed yesterday.
I have to tell you, what the president signed yesterday is like all my first term dreams coming true. I mean, it really is. I mean, there's only so much of it is classified that there's only so much you can talk about. But suffice it to say that I laid out a path exactly like this in the first term, and the deep state just universally rose up and took it on. And there wasn't enough support within the White House, I'm not talking about the president, to overcome Mark Esper, the NSA, the military industrial complex that wants to go fight Middle East terror, and they want to spend billions of dollars to do it, despite the fact that Rod's comments are on the money. At the street level, these cartels in the Western Hemisphere have more impact on real life in America than Middle Eastern terror cells. And now they're not an apples to apples comparison, but this finally focuses on putting America first in a national security environment in a way that will actually matter in people's lives. And look, we're all Americans here. It's easy to look at this problem from our side of the border. Rod's comment about the corruption in Mexico, absolutely correct. In my view, the one and virtually only place that the Department of Justice has a role to play here is in prosecuting corrupt government officials, both of our country and of Mexico in particular, and bringing them to justice. The rest of this is a war, and they've been waging war on us. And it's about time we had a president who's willing to wage war on them. And this is not like Islamic terror cells where they try to isolate themselves from society and so forth. These folks in Mexico they are the government for 1/6 of the territory of Mexico, and they dispute with the Mexican government another full 1/6 of the entire country physically, particularly in the northern part of the country that borders the United States. That's frankly hard for us to conceive of in this country. These aren't gangs. They're de facto governments that use terrorist tactics to pursue organized crime goals. And until we deal with them that way, which the president has now declared we're about to start doing for the first time in our history, then they're going to operate pretty freely. I should note that throughout Mexico's history, literally its entire history since it has broken away from various European powers, Spanish and French, depending on when, they have had this kind of problem. The government of Mexico, when it was run by the people of Mexico, has never in its entire history controlled its entire own country. Again, hard for us to imagine and fathom here north of the border, but that's the history down there. And you combine that with a great deal of pride, and it's awfully hard for us to meddle, that's how they perceive it, in their country. But this stuff is having real effects in America. It is a violation of international law to allow your territory to be used to do harm to a neighbor. They've been violating that portion of international law for the entire lives of all three of us. And it's about time we have a president who's willing to take it on head on.
Ken, you're right. I think it's very hard for people to conceive what it means when a cartel is controlling the government and also south of our border. When I first went to the border and began really studying the issues with it, it was back in 2013. And I interviewed sheriffs along the way, and they explained how the cartels operate and that the cartels control different sections and sectors all the way along the border. And if somebody is going across the border, it is only because the cartel has okayed it. And sometimes they would send people up one area so it would distract our border patrol, and they'd send drugs up another area while our border patrol was all distracted by the humans coming across. It's hard to understand this if you haven't studied it and paid attention to it. If you haven't studied it, I don't know, it almost seems like we're making it up, like it's a dream or something, but it's not. It's what's really going on.
Yes. Yeah, and the only humane path, everybody likes to talk about humanity on the other side of the aisle. The only humane path is a secure border, where everyone in the world knows that taking this dangerous trip and putting yourselves at the mercy of the most evil, vicious people in the Western Hemisphere is not an option. And so that's literally the only way to keep them safe. Women and children are abused at an unbelievable rate on these trips into the United States or to the United States. They don't get in anymore. Literally, I believe we've passed 1 year under the Trump administration with a 0 catch and release, which is quite different than the rotating turnstile of the Biden administration. And that makes all the difference in the world. You haven't seen in the news in over a year anything about the border because it is not newsworthy. As I used to tell my security guards at the Department of Homeland Security, I hope you have a boring day, because that's a good day if you're a security guard. And if you're a Border Patrol agent, everything running according to Hoyle is a good day. You don't want to be in the news. News means bad news. That's the only kind of news that gets made other than things operating as they should. Having said that, these are very sophisticated, very well funded, thanks to Joe Biden in part, organizations we're contending with. They literally have military capabilities. They have intelligence networks and capabilities that extend into this country. And it's about time we started facing off with them with the full might, intelligence, and ability of not just the Department of Homeland Security, but the Departments of State, War, Treasury, and HHS dealing with the children. So you also end up with agriculture, labor, and interior. A good chunk of the border is Indian territory. So we have a complicating factor there. As you noted, Jenny Beth, you've been going down there for a long time, and I give you a lot of credit for educating yourself as someone who wasn't in a position of responsibility, but was communicating to Americans about this. I wish reporters who reported on the border would put as much effort in as you have. But it is nothing less than complicated for sure. You throw in literally Indian reservations that span the Mexican-U.S. border. So tribes in Arizona, for example, that exist on both sides of the border. So we throw in another complication like that. But things have been improved on the border so dramatically that this administration can turn its attention to actually deporting the who knows how many, 20, 30 million illegals who are already here. And that's what I hope they focus on for the next 3 years.
Same. I hope that they focus on that as well. So Sebastian Gorka has been making a claim that stops people cold. He says Americans have been killed by cartel fentanyl. More Americans have been killed by cartel fentanyl than every U.S. military conflict since World War II. Let's take a look at this clip.
One sentence: we are returning to common sense, reality-based counterterrorism. One of the first things the president says in his trenchant foreword, and then we stress later on page 1, is that we will not permit the most powerful national security tools in the world, especially underneath the counterterrorism rubric, to be used for political purposes against innocent Americans. We're not going to allow, as the Biden administration did, Catholics in Richmond to be targeted because they go to Latin Mass, members of Congress like Tulsi Gabbard to be put on no-fly lists, or to use armed federal law enforcement to raid the home of a former president, as happened at Mar-a-Lago because President Trump was going to win that election. We're not going to let that happen. So we're going to rip politics out of counterterrorism, and then we're going to focus on the real threats in 3 main threat groups. Number 1, the cartels, under the incredible leadership of the Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller, the new S1, the new Secretary at Homeland Security, Senator Mullen, and then, of course, the second category is my remit, the global jihadi movement, so dealing the ultimate death blows to groups like al-Qaeda or ISIS. And then the third category, sadly, because the left has normalized violence or made it a permissible thing to do, we're going to identify and neutralize the left-wing radicals like Antifa, like the anarchists who took the life of my good friend Charlie Kirk, that have tried on multiple occasions to kill President Trump. We will not permit you to use violence against your fellow Americans for political purposes.
So that clip was from Just the News, John Solomon's show, and Sebastian Gorka was on there yesterday. I want to just make sure on the podcast I'm giving them credit as well. It was on the video images. So, Rod, if what Sebastian is saying is true about the number of people who've been killed with fentanyl versus all the other, all the conflicts since World War II, or even close to true, why did it take all the way until 2026 for a presidential counterterrorism document to admit this?
Well, it's always been true. I mean, there's no question he's correct. And the first term was characterized by a tremendous pushback, as Ken was just saying. You still had the deep state very much in control, in my assessment. And I mean no disrespect in saying this. The president was a brilliant choice for America because he was an outsider. But in the first term, he got blindsided by a lot of the reality in Washington precisely because he was an outsider. He used the last 4 years brilliantly. There is no question that he and many wise people sat around and plotted out every moment of every day of the 4 years of a second term. And so you're seeing action on some of these things now because they've actually, they knew what the root problem was, how to go after it, how to replace key personnel, which, by the way, is an ongoing process. the deep state is not gone. The deep staters are not gone, but they've made a lot more progress against them now, and we're able to move really tremendous public policy. Now, the other side of this, as you know, is that some of these agencies have been steeped in this dogma that, you know, violence is from the right and terrorism is a phenomenon of the right wing and all of this nonsense. When was the last time you saw a bunch of church ladies from down at the Baptist church go out and have a riot? It just doesn't happen. And you didn't see it during COVID. You had rioting in blue states. You had zero in states like Florida, where I am. It just did not happen at all because it wasn't permitted at all. And you don't have Republicans doing that way. One of the most, I realize they pretended that J6 wasn't a Fedsurrection, but, you know, the only real insurrection I can remember from Republicans would have been the Brooks Brothers revolt in 2000. You know, we just aren't those people. So, you know, if you have a bunch of people who are actually committed to political violence, and we know that that's the case because there was a YouGov survey in September that asked people, you know, do you believe that political violence is ever justified? Among very conservative men, 45 and younger, the answer was yes for 3%. For liberal and progressive men, 45 and younger, the number was 26%. So more than 1 in 4 believe that political violence is frankly a good thing and probably necessary since we're dealing with, as you know, literally Hitler. And once you demonize somebody to that degree, to a group of people who are this willing to break outside of the law and commit violent acts, there's no question what's going to happen. And that's why we have a president who has now been shot at or attempted to be shot at 3 separate times that we know of. And you know, it's not going to be the end of it.
No, it absolutely won't be. Hey, really quickly, but don't elaborate too much. The Brooks Brothers revolt, that was in Tennessee. Is that correct?
I believe that was in Miami. That
Miami?
was during the Al Gore attempted recount.
Okay.
And the irony there, as you know, is that the New York Times and the Washington Post came down here and recounted the election according to the rules Al Gore was arguing for before the U.S. Supreme Court. And what they found was that Bush had won by an even bigger margin. Right. So they kind of buried that story. But yeah, that was fun.
Didn't serve the narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
And just for the record, since we're mentioning the 2000 election, the thing about that election is that Florida opened up all the ballots after the election and allowed the media to come in and count every single one. And there was sunshine and transparency. Yep. So we didn't have to wonder if the counting had been done correctly. Had Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Michigan done the exact same thing after 2020, well, I think we would have seen different results. But the fact that they were unwilling to continues to allow questions to linger to this day.
Also, Jenny Beth, if I could, Florida knew they had screwed up. I mean, that was humiliating for Florida. It was a pathetically run election. And only 3 years before, a judge had thrown out the Miami mayoral election because of fraud and cheating and incompetence all piled up. They turned around, Jeb Bush and the legislature, much like Ron DeSantis has been doing, they turned around and they aggressively, year after year after year, mercilessly improved their election system. They now have the best run elections in any large state in America. They throw 6 million votes up on the board 1 hour after their polls close. It's not even the Democrats in Florida complain about the quality of the outcomes, and they're getting just the floor wiped with them. They learned from their mistakes, and they acted on their mistakes with humility and determination, and they brought themselves from the back of the pack to the front of the pack.
That's exactly right. And it takes maturity to be able to admit your mistakes and learn from it. So I appreciate the leaders of Florida throughout the entire state who work to clean up the state. And too bad there are other states who are just too too immature to do the same thing. Okay, we're going to take a really quick break, and it is time to get that phone out and call your senators. We've got to pass the Save America Act. And there are really 4 Republican senators right now that are blocking it, but we also have no Democrats who are willing to vote for it. So dial 202-224-3121, 202-224-3121, and call both of your senators. You can also go to passthesaveamericaact.com to send an email and get more information. All right, we'll be right back. Welcome back. We have Rod Martin and Ken Cuccinelli with me today. Ken Cuccinelli has been in the middle of the Virginia redistricting fight, and here is what is at stake. Virginia went from 51% for Harris in 2024 in the presidential election, or it went that in that direction. The Commonwealth deserves about equal representation it deserves equal representation under the law, no matter what, for whether you supported President Trump or President Biden. And the state should have some semblance of representation based on the number of Republicans who are in the state and the ability to get a fair district out of it. But Democrats just pushed through a new congressional delegation map that would be 10 Democrats to 1 Republican, 10-1 from a 51% Democrat state. The Virginia Supreme Court is now deciding whether that map stands or not. So I'm going to ask Ken a few questions, and then we'll pull Rod back into the conversation. But because Ken has been working on this so much and it's his home state, I want him to walk us through what is at stake. The state was 6 Democrats to 5 Republicans with the congressional seat, and now if this new map holds, it's going to be 10-1. Ken, tell us, how is it constitutional? Is by the United States Constitution, and what about by the Virginia Constitution?
So there are no federal constitutional issues at stake. These are all state constitutional and legal issues, and there's a lot of them. And like many states, Virginia requires, well, first of all, so people know, to do this gerrymander, the Democrats have to amend our state constitution, because just 5 years ago, I was part of a bipartisan group that got a bipartisan redistricting commission that gave us this 6-5 map. By the electoral votes, and you were recounting them there, Jenny Beth, we are one of the fairest mapped states in the country for our congressional delegation. And that was only 5 years ago, and it was by a 2-1 margin of Virginia voters. Well, so to do their new gerrymander, they have to amend the Constitution to undo the bipartisan redistricting commission. And of course, they're running this whole program on the Trump derangement syndrome. That's their motivation they give. They say they're running against Trump. This is all to correct Trump, et cetera. Nonetheless, they have to do it under the Virginia laws and Constitution. And like many states, Virginia, to amend its Constitution, requires the General Assembly to first pass a proposed amendment to the state Constitution, and then have an intervening election of the General Assembly. So there's a new General Assembly. And then the new General Assembly must pass the same exact amendment again before it is put on the ballot before the people to vote on. called first passage and second passage. Well, you'll recall that Abigail Spanberger was elected governor in Virginia last year. We have odd year elections in Virginia for our state offices. And one of the gifts the Democrats gave us last time they had the House, Senate, and governorship in 2020 was they gave us a 45-day election. So voting in the 2025 election began on September 19th. But the General Assembly, controlled by Democrats, did not pass this proposed amendment to the Constitution, state Constitution, for the first time until Halloween, 6 weeks later, after over 1 million Virginians had voted in early voting. And they still want to treat that as the intervening election required under the state Constitution. There's also a constitutional question about whether they could even bring up an amendment in the special session of the General Assembly they were in. That's a second constitutional question. And there's a statute that they didn't comply with because they couldn't, that requires posting public notice of proposed amendments 90 days before an election, including the intervening election. So those are the 2025 legal and constitutional violations the Democrat General Assembly is accused of. And those are the issues that you heard oral argument before the Virginia Supreme Court a week ago Monday. They took briefing only 2 days after the referendum. And we're all waiting on the order in that case. That case, I believe, is going to decide the outcome. I think it's going to have the referendum thrown out based on the failure to have an intervening election. Since we all work on election security together, it's worth noting that the Democrats' lawyer, when asked about people who voted early and had no idea this was coming, he basically said, well, that's just too bad. You vote early at your own risk. These are the Democrats that have told us that early voting is holy writ. And now they're flushing 1 million of these voters right down the toilet in their power grab to get after Trump. So that's the case currently everybody's waiting on at the Supreme Court. The one being held at the Supreme Court is the 2026 constitutional violation and statutory violation, including the outrageous language the Democrats put on the ballot. They literally said you're voting for fairness. We have a plain English rule. The judge that heard the case said that violated even the plain English rule. It was so misleading. But they also violated the Constitution again in 2026 with the second passage is required to be 90 days before the amendment is submitted to the voters. Well, back to their 45-day election again. Second passage was January 16th, and voting started on the referendum on March 6th. Now, you don't need an engineering degree like I went and got to know that that is less than 90 days, since it's less than 2 months. Simple math. Even people who went to law school to avoid doing math know that. And so that's their challenge if they even get to those arguments. The Supreme Court has kept in place the injunction that the trial court put in place based on the 2026 violations. And I take that as a major sign that the Virginia Supreme Court knows it's going to throw out the referendum and so is leaving the injunction in place so the mechanics of the election don't start rolling with the wrong lines, and we're just waiting on an order to that effect. So that's a lot. That's without even touching on the map, which itself violates a different part of the Constitution, but we won't even get to the map if their referendum doesn't survive. And as former Attorney General of Virginia and one of the few people who've spent time litigating the Virginia Constitution, I don't think this is going to survive. It simply was so brazen. I've been calling it gangsta legislating. They didn't care about the rules. They trampled the rules. And when we say rules, we're talking about Constitution here. And that is now all coming back to bite them in the behind. And a lot of finger pointing starting among the Democrats. They think they're going to lose now, I believe. They wouldn't say that publicly, but they do. And I think this is going to throw out a major state that the Dems were relying on to pick up 4 new seats. And we're going to have a competitive congressional race in our 6-5 map in 2026 and beyond.
So the fact that they said that the early voting, basically you do that at your own risk, that sure seems like it is violating some sort of a constitutional right there. And I don't know what it would be if it does, but that's an atrocious thing for an attorney to go and, well, you just vote, you vote early at your own risk. Okay, well, what if you didn't vote early and you had issues on election day? Would they say, well, you voted on election day at your own risk? When you go to vote, it shouldn't matter which day you're voting. If you're voting within the legally allowed time within a state, your vote counts as much as anyone else's vote counts.
Jenny Beth, you could be a Virginia Supreme Court justice. Justice Wes Russell pressed the lawyer for Democrat Attorney General Jay Jones. Well, what if they pass the amendment at 6 p.m. on Election Day? Our polls close at 7 p.m. in Virginia. And the lawyer had no answer. Right along the lines you're talking about, Jenny Beth, he took it to an even greater legal extreme, which is why you have oral argument, is to put them on the spot on these things. He couldn't answer the question. And the reason is there isn't a good answer. But to your point on the early voters, the Democrats' position is the election is just election day. And they meant you vote early at your own risk. And they are arguing that the court should view the election for intervening election purposes as strictly election day. That's what's inspired Justice Russell's question. Well, what about 6 o'clock on Election Day? And, as I said, the other side couldn't handle that. I believe, Jenny Beth, that is going to be the element of the Constitution that the court will decide upon. They will not decide the special session questions because they will say this referendum is being thrown out. So anyway, we don't need to decide the additional question, and so we will not. And I would also note just philosophically that Virginia is one of 2 states where the General Assembly picks the justices. So separation of powers is a real interesting question here. And it's a greater conflict in the separation of powers sense between the judiciary and the legislative branch for the judiciary to judge the schedule and agenda, special session of the General Assembly, than it is to simply keep them in the guardrails of what it requires to pass a constitutional amendment. One is less conflictory with the separation of powers, which is another reason to decide it on the election issue rather than the special session issue.
Okay. And we should be hearing from the court any day now, right? Because
we
they've
could
got
hear today. Thursday is a common date for the issuance of their opinions. It's the usual date, although nothing else about the schedule of this case has been usual. I would not be surprised if we hear before the end of the day today, but if not today, it could be any day.
Okay. And then, so you've been working this through the Virginia courts, and then Tuesday night, Indiana showed us a different path. They had not voted for redistricting in their state legislature, and 6 Republican incumbents who blocked that redistricting are now gone. They were defeated in their primaries by Trump-backed challengers. Rod, what do you make of that election?
Well, it was just glorious, wasn't it? I have had to listen now for months to ding-dongs online talking about how Trump has destroyed MAGA and the whole conservative movement is behind Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and blah, blah, blah. Well, I believe we've had a total of about 4 incumbent state senators in Indiana lose their seat in the last 25 years. It just doesn't happen. And this is a state Senate that is 50 total seats, 40 of them Republican. So there's no question this is an overwhelming Republican supermajority. And Donald Trump endorses these challengers in Republican primary races, and they all win. They all win. So first and foremost, yes, the redistricting issue was big in the minds of Indiana Republican primary voters. But second, the president's endorsement is possibly at the peak strength any of us have seen for any political leader of either party in memory. I don't know who you would compare that to. It was just extraordinary, especially when you remember the first year of the first term, when all the media could do was talk about how Donald Trump had no coattails at all. So, you know, as with every other thing the media has said about Donald Trump, that was 180 degrees from the truth. In any case, Indiana is just glorious, and it is a statement to the Republican Party. We're tired of your rhinos. We are tired of your never Trumpers. Get on the team or get off the bus. And we're seeing a lot more of these guys do exactly that. I saw a thing where Nick Fuentes today said that he's proud to be a Democrat in 2026. Well, he was a Democrat in 2025 and 2024. He just wasn't honest about it. And the same thing was true for Bill Kristol and David French. Yeah. So, you know, we have come a long way to let's just call it purifying the Republican Party. This has always been a 70% conservative party at worst. The Rhino wing was a tail wagging a huge dog, and that is finally changing. So it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens next. You know, Marco is surging. Vance is incredible. We got other great guys like Ron DeSantis and Ted Cruz and countless others. The bench is strong. I don't know what will happen in 28. It'll be very different from Donald Trump because Trump is unique. But I think ideologically, Indiana shows you the future, which is much, much more conservative and much, much more willing to win instead of just lose with dignity. I am so fed up with losing with dignity. It's about time we actually did what our voters sent us to do, which is institute the policies they voted for. And Donald Trump has not been afraid to do it. This new crew won't be either.
Can I make a side comment there, Jenny Beth? Rob raises a real interesting observation, as he always does, and that is the bench. Forget who may become the successor to Donald Trump as the nominee of the GOP. Look at those contenders and compare the quality that they bring to the table of actual success, of actual performance in their jobs over the years compared to the Democrats. The Democrats seem to insist on failure for promotion. And you compare whose names are floated on the Republican side at this stage for the next, person in line. That's a bad phrase, but versus the bench of the Democrats, and it is no comparison in the sheer quality of competency between the two benches. It's a real interesting point of comparison, and what we really want is to cultivate that all the way down to dog catcher. We want better dog catchers than they have. We want our dog catchers to catch more dogs and to catch them better and within budget and with surpluses to return back to the local taxpayers, all the way up and down the line. And that bench comparison that Rob drew out is a really interesting one that has real world implications for the quality of our lives and living. We saw it really in the LA debate. I mean, crushing, and not on Republican Democrat, although the Democrats are trying to play that card, but on real life impact on LA. And it was just a slaughter. I've never seen anyone voted randomly to have won a debate by over 80%. Pratt was voted 88% the winner of that debate. And it was on reality. That it was just plain old reality and competency. And of course, incompetency on the part of the two Democrats who were his competitors.
Yeah, Ken, and you make a good point. Pratt is highlighting the failures of socialism and communism in California, and also just elitist indifference to those who they deem unworthy. So you've got the socialistic factor going on, and then you just have people who think they're better than everyone else, and he's highlighting that and showing how that is a problem. And he's fighting figuratively and with rhetoric. He's fighting and he's standing up for his values, and he's saying, this is what I'm going to do. This is not how things should be done. These are the problems with the current administration. This is how it affected me personally. Here's my house. It's a trailer on sitting on the front yard of what used to be my house. And
because you, Karen Bass, let it burn because of your incompetence. And his parents' house, for people watching who don't know that. I mean, that's some motivation right there.
Right. And there are other people in LA who were affected by this. And even if your house was still standing, you saw this happen to your neighbors and your friends and your family. And for me to know like 4 people in that area, LA is not a conservative area. So for me to know 4 or 5 people who were directly affected by that, imagine if you live in the area, you have to know dozens of people who were affected by it. And it affects everyone. And then you've got the homelessness situation, and you've got the crime and all the other problems. And he's showing it and highlighting it. And it goes to something also that, Rod, you were just saying. And I think this is what happened a little bit in Indiana as well. People want the attitude of our elected officials, like what we have seen from President Trump. They want someone who is going to fight. And they don't mean punch people in the face, but what they mean is stand up for me. I'm suffering here. My life isn't what it should be. I don't have enough freedom. The government is crushing me. Stand up for me and fight for me the way you would fight for yourself. And that is what President Trump, I think, is doing for America and for the American citizens every single day when it comes to securing the border, when it comes to cutting taxes, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to fentanyl and counterterrorism, and the list goes on and on and on. And I think that is part of what just played out in Indiana. They watched these politicians who were unwilling to redistrict. Now, we can talk about whether we think that a massively swung map where you've got all red or red and a tiny little blip of blue is fair or not, and whether it should or shouldn't be that way, or whether it's all blue with a blip of red. It's constitutional, and elections do have consequences. So there is some of that coming to play. But what the voters in Indiana saw was that the Indiana State Senate was unwilling to stand up and fight when it came to congressional districts in their state. Then they watched as Virginia was like, to heck with everyone else. We're just going to completely decimate the Republican Party and Republican elected officials in Virginia. To heck with our Constitution. It doesn't matter what our rules and laws say. We're going to do it anyway. And the people of Virginia are like, we don't care. We're fighting because we just want the liberals to control everything. And I think then the voters went in and said, yeah, we want someone who's going to fight like the people in Virginia. The left is fighting against us in Virginia. And I think that's part of the lesson that was just sent from Indiana. And it's something we need to take into account. I have 2 more quick questions on the subject of redistricting, because there's an overarching theme here that ties together. So, Ken, last week, the Supreme Court ruled about redistricting and that there cannot be racial discrimination, and the race cannot factor into redistricting. Do I have that summary correct? Correct me if I'm wrong. And what did you make of that ruling, and how does it affect other states?
You do have that correct. I mean, fundamentally, the Voting Rights Act forbids discrimination on the basis of race, period, full stop. Now, and that's what the Supreme Court said. And the strange thing about that from the left's perspective is that gets rid of the consideration of race. Look, I was Virginia's Attorney General at the last time that pre-clearance was required. I had to go through the Obama DOJ, and the Voting Rights Act at the same time required legislators in southern states, for example, not just southern states, but to factor race in, but don't be discriminatory about factoring race in. Well, how do you prioritize race at the same time you don't discriminate based on race? And remember, don't just think discriminate black. There's white, there's Hispanic, and it was impossible. It was impossible. And the Supreme Court said in its ruling last week, the Voting Rights Act forbids racial discrimination, period. It does not forbid political discrimination. And if you want to use the Voting Rights Act to dispute a map, you have to parse out political consequences from racial consequences. And the Dems have consistently conflated black and Democrat. And under the Voting Rights Act, they argue black. When they go do state redistricting for gerrymandering, they argue Democrat. And so they want to have their cake and eat it too. And the Supreme Court said, no, it's one or the other. And that's where things stand now. So now the states that have been somewhat shackled, not inappropriately historically. I know what my state was doing in the 60s to black voters. That was appropriate, but it isn't happening anymore. And I can speak for Virginia from personal knowledge. And in the absence of discrimination, the court's saying all states are going to be treated equal. Nobody can discriminate. We have no evidence. Congress has put no evidence in the record of systematic discrimination as used to exist, like in Virginia, any longer. So it's now that the rules are the same for everybody. And now that's why you see Alabama coming into session in Tennessee, because they can just draw district lines the way everybody else drew them before these rather contradictory legal requirements under previous muddled interpretations of the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, and then speaking of Tennessee, right as we were going live, we got word that the Tennessee House has voted to turn Shelby County into 3 Republican-controlled districts, and it's still going before the Senate in Tennessee, and protesters broke out of, I don't think protesters broke out after the Virginia election, but protesters broke out in the Tennessee House when the vote did not go the way that the left wanted it. Rod, what do you make of the redistricting in Tennessee and what other states may wind up doing because of the Supreme Court ruling last week?
Well, look, in a perfect world, no one would gerrymander, and we should work toward that world. We're in the same place with districting that we're in with tariffs, that we're in with NATO countries freeloading on the United States taxpayer, on countless things around the world, where if you don't bop them in the nose, metaphorically, they'll do it literally, we'll do it metaphorically. If you don't bop the bully in the nose, it's never going to get better. And Donald Trump is the perfect guy for that. So if Tennessee teaches this lesson, it's a lesson that's long overdue. The part that gets left out while the media pretends that Texas started this is, for example, every one of the 6 states in New England, which have about 40% Republican electorates, but have 0 Republican House seats, 0, and have had 0 for as long as I can remember. They want to come back and talk about the need to deal with the racist past of the South. Well, I'm sorry, that happened before I was born. Look at my gray beard. That happened before I was born. It's ridiculous. So we have to actually look, first of all, at the world the way it is, which includes a post-racial society, except so far as the race hustlers who run the Democratic Party can gin up new racism, which they've had an incredibly difficult time doing on our side, which is why the SPLC was funding the Unite the Right rally and the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party, because the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party can't raise money if Democrats don't give it to them. And that's just where we are today. And the other place we are is the reality that they came after Virginia the way they did because they didn't have a lot of choices. They've already maxed out the gerrymandering in nearly every blue state. So all they had left was to eke out a little bit more in Virginia and California. If Republicans just draw constitutionally reasonable districts across the South, we're going to have a huge swing in November toward the Republicans. And I really think we're going to hold Congress. I think we're going to hold both houses, but this is going to play into it because we have now for decades been spotting the Democrats at least 21 U.S. House seats off the top for unconstitutional reasons. And that just ended.
Those are really important numbers there, Rod. Thank you for that analysis. Okay, we're going to go to a few other stories that are breaking in the news yesterday and today, and we'll try to go through them a little rapid fire style, because we're getting towards the end of we're definitely at the end of the hour. But the FBI this week raided the home of the offices of Virginia State Senator Louise Lucas, one of the most powerful Democrats in Virginia, in the Virginia General Assembly. Ken, tell us what just happened and why are you laughing and what should we be watching for with this?
Well, for those who've periodically heard 10F and 1 for the Virginia redistricting, that came from Louise Lucas, who just got raided by the FBI. Important thing to know, this investigation began under the Biden administration. This is not a Trump ordered or instructed investigation. She sells pot and her business partner was raided earlier in the week. So this isn't a terrible shock. She's also, you've seen how she legislates. She doesn't care about the rules. One might reasonably expect she doesn't care about a lot of other rules too. Innocent till proven guilty, but this is not something that just cropped up. This has literally been going on for years. And this is just when the FBI moved on the indictments. So it has roiled and boiled and provided much laughter. I mean, she is a witch. She is a witch. She is a witch to Abigail Spanberger, her fellow Democrat governor. She torments and tortures her own team. You don't need me saying it. But lest anybody get their hopes up, even if she had to step out of office, we're not going to win that district. Nonetheless, she brings a coarseness to a Virginia politics that would make a sailor blush. So this is going to be very interesting. It is going to roil. She is the most powerful senator in Virginia. She's not the majority leader. That's not the most powerful senator in Virginia. She runs appropriations. That's the most powerful senator in Virginia. She believes she runs the state, not the governor. And she's been mouthing off at Spanberger publicly already in Spanberger's term. That honeymoon is over for Spanberger, and Louise Lucas is part of the reason why. So Spanberger is probably going behind closed doors and just giggling her tail off.
That is a very good take there. So thank you for sharing that with us. And if indeed she has committed crimes, or it's all alleged right now, and it will play out in a court of law as it should. What you just said about the district would still go blue no matter what. Look, you and I can both respect a fair election. We understand Democrats are going to win some seats. Republicans are going to win others. What I think that we should all be able to agree with, even across the aisle, is we don't want corrupt, law-breaking politicians in those positions. So, okay, now shifting gears to earlier today, Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with Pope Leo XIV at the Vatican's Apostolic Palace. This is the first time the first American-born pope in history. He's from Chicago. He's been openly critical of the Trump administration, especially on immigration and the military operation in Iran. Secretary Rubio is a devout Catholic. He is the diplomatic bridge between the American president and the American pope, who disagree on very significant policy questions. Rod, what's your read here? Is it going to be a genuine reset between the administration and the Vatican? Is it damage control? What do you think Secretary Rubio will be able to accomplish?
Well, first, I'm really proud of my former senator, Marco Rubio, who, I was really proud of when he won that Senate seat in the first place, improbably. And then, he went to Washington and kind of messed up for a little while with the Gang of Eight. And then he got his act together. And now he's possibly our best modern Secretary of State. I mean, he's going to be at least as consequential as Kissinger. So 3 cheers for Marco Rubio. And he articulates the message better than almost anybody. It's really been quite extraordinary and a little bit of a surprise. But regardless, will he do well with the Pope? Sure. I mean, he absolutely has that capacity. That was part of why he foolishly got involved with the Gang of Eight in the first place. He was always able in Tallahassee to make the deal that nobody else could make. So I think that there's a lot of reason for hope there. On the other hand, this Pope is not exactly a conservative. That's not going to change, and nobody can really tell him what to do. So I'm sure this will be a point of contention for at least the next 3 years, hopefully the next 16.
Yeah, I hope that that he can smooth things over enough, and perhaps the Pope and the president can just agree to disagree and not have to make it so public.
Yeah, I think he'll calm the waters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and hopefully the Pope won't go back on 60 Minutes attacking the president. Okay. Before we let our guests go, I want to take a moment to mark something historic that happened yesterday. Justice Clarence Thomas became the second longest serving Supreme Court justice in American history, surpassing Justice John Paul Stevens. 34 years, 196 days on the court, more than 800 opinions. He has gone from being the lone dissenter consistently upholding originalism to the justice, or to one who the justices originally dismissed his methodology as fringe, and now he's a justice whose philosophy now defines the constitutional majority and has helped define what conservatism in America means. Bruin, Dobbs, affirmative action, the originalist revolution that everyone said would never happen, happened because one man held his convictions for over 34 years. Rod, start us off. Put this milestone in perspective for our audience. What does it mean for the conservative legal movement and the conservative movement more broadly?
Well, first, before long, he's going to be the longest serving, which is glorious, and may the king live forever. This is truly one of the greatest justices in the history of the country, and it's hard to find a peer. Certainly today, we've had a lot of lesser lights, and we've had a few true greats like Scalia. And Alito has certainly surpassed most people's expectations, I think, although I was a big fan from the first. I just marvel at the way the Democrats have treated this man throughout his now long career on the court and getting confirmed for the court. A party that pretends to want to elevate Black people has done more to demonize, frequently on an absolutely racist basis, Clarence Thomas than just about anybody you can point at, whether they're attacking his interracial marriage, whether they're attacking him as an Uncle Tom, or all these slurs, all these horrible things. And he is just a rock, and he just keeps doing his thing, which is, by the way, some of the most important intellectual heavy lifting ever done by the modern conservative movement. Phyllis Schlafly told us, we should offer a choice, not an echo. Clarence Thomas has consistently given us a choice, two very different visions of the way we should look at the U.S. Constitution and the entire American experiment, and nobody has done a better job of persuading the people he was targeting of the rightness of his cause. Again, I hope we get another 30 years out of him.
Ken, you're an attorney or former attorney general. What do you make of this historic milestone?
Oh my gosh, what a country. We're the greatest country in the history of the world, and how much greater we could be with 8 more Clarence Thomases. Scalia arguably did more to move the intellectual legal world in the right direction to originalism, textualism. But Justice Thomas is the greatest justice of our lifetimes, and certainly one of the greatest that you could count on one hand. Of course, so is Scalia, of the entire history of the United States. And there are things he does that took judicial courage, like not accepting error, things like substantive due process, for example, that he continually comes back to rail against. And I'm being very legally geeky here for some people watching, but these are 100-year-old, frankly, maladies that the court created for itself that he doesn't accept because they are error. They are wrong. They are inconsistent and not found in the Constitution. I mean, talk about being an absolute rock for truth. He stands not against just the other 8 justices sometimes, but against 100 years of those 8 justices. And he doesn't bat an eye in doing it. It's a level of intellectual courage that is, to say rare, sort of strains the use of the word rare. We are very blessed as a country to have even him and the example he has set over the years, and to do it as joyously as he does it. Anybody who's heard that laugh knows what I'm talking about. And he really is a joyful warrior for the truth. He's not advocating for our side in any political sense. He'll rule against anybody who's wrong. But I'll tell you whose side he is on, and that is the founders. And yes, just as a judge should be. And unless and until the Constitution gets amended, that's where judges should land. And he always does, day after day, year after year, for so many years. And it's been a real blessing for the United States of America.
Yeah.
Justice Gorsuch described Justice Thomas as someone who has lived the American story, the American dream. Here is Justice Thomas in his own words talking about the impact his grandfather had on his education.
He had gone his own way and converted to Roman Catholicism in 1949. It followed that Catholic schools had to be better than public schools. So he sent my brother and me to one. Remember now, I'm 7 years old. My brother's 6. And he says to us, you are going to go to school every day. And if you are sick, you're still going. And if you die, you will go, I will take your body for 3 days to make sure you're not faking. And he meant it. I mean, the thing about it is, it's one thing if somebody says it and you think they're exaggerating. He wasn't that kind of guy. The Catholic schools were very orderly. My brother used to say, when you walked in there, you could hear a gnat tiptoeing across cotton. It was segregated. The nuns didn't much appreciate the fact that blacks were treated that way. They were mostly Irish nuns, and they were outspoken too. Oh God, I love it. They were on our side from day one.
Kim, what do you think about the impact Clarence Thomas' father, or rather grandfather, had on his life? And what can we as parents and grandparents learn from his grandfather's example?
Well, that's a good question. His grandfather didn't know he was raising a Supreme Court justice. And it's pretty clear he wouldn't have done anything different. And if that's not a lesson for every parent, to no matter how valuable you believe what you have in your hands of that child is, God thinks even more of them. So,
Rod?
It is exactly as Ken says. You don't know what your children are going to become. You don't know what your great grandchildren are going to become. We have to take education seriously. We have to take character seriously, and we have to be hands-on. It is not acceptable to outsource the child rearing function to the state. It's just not. And, some people have to be in public schools. I did. We lived in a little country town. We didn't have any private schools, and homeschooling wasn't a thing yet. And that worked out. But my parents were deeply involved in everything at the school and at home. And, and we homeschooled when we had kids. So we've seen this from both sides. But the responsibility for parenting is with parents, and sometimes that gets a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, depending on your circumstances. But we have to take that seriously. It's the single most important stewardship God has given us. And thank God for Clarence Thomas's grandfather. What an amazing example to us all.
Absolutely. And I'm so thankful for Clarence Thomas. I think he's the best justice we've ever had. And I'm thankful for his grandfather. They were living in segregated times in the Deep South, and he did not let that stop. The grandfather did not let that stop him from making sure that his grandson was raised with discipline and order and education. And faith in God and looking to God. And Ken, as you were talking a couple of minutes ago about how Clarence Thomas is okay if he's standing up to 100 years of 8 justices and being the lone dissenter against years and years, not centuries, but decades of justices who got things wrong. He's okay being the lone dissenter. And I think that's because he completely understands the Constitution, and he is comfortable with what he understands about the Constitution. And because he knows he's accountable to God. He's not accountable to all of us.
Right.
And that clip shows that the importance of education, the importance of understanding where you came from, the importance of understanding that it doesn't matter your circumstances in this country. In this country, you can become anything if you set your mind to it, and the importance of looking to our Heavenly Father. For anyone who has not seen this documentary, that's where the clip is from. The documentary is called Created Equal. You can purchase it on Amazon. There is also an autobiography that Clarence Thomas has written, My Grandfather's Son. Both are excellent. I highly recommend them. He recently spoke. I forgot where he spoke. There is C-SPAN footage of that speech. He doesn't give a lot of speeches. He doesn't speak a lot on the court. So go read these books, watch the documentary, learn more about this amazing
almost
justice.
Not at all on the court until Justice Scalia passed away.
Yeah, true.
Which is interesting.
It really is. Well, Rod Martin and Ken Cuccinelli, thank you so much for being with me today. You've been really generous with your time, and you both were brilliant as always. Thank you very much for being on.
Good to be with you both.
All right, we're going to move on to a Constitution Minute, and let me just make sure I've got that pulled up right here. As we mark Justice Thomas's impressive milestone on the Supreme Court, I want to explain the philosophy he built his career on and why it matters to every American who cares about the Constitution. It's called originalism, and it's actually a simple idea, even though legal scholars spend careers debating it. Originalism means this. When a court interprets a constitution, it asks what the words meant to the people who wrote them and ratified them at the time they were written, not what a judge in 2026 thinks they should mean, not what would produce a convenient outcome for today. It's what did the words mean in their original meaning when they were adopted. The alternative, which has dominated American courts for most of the 20th and 21st century, is sometimes called a living constitution. It's the idea that the Constitution is a flexible document that evolves with the times and that the judges are the ones who do the evolving. Originalists, Clarence Thomas, chief among them, says that approach hands enormous unchecked power to unelected judges. It takes decisions that belong to the people's elected representatives and puts them in the hands of 9 lawyers in Washington, D.C. For more than 34 years, Clarence Thomas has written opinions, many of them alone, in dissent, arguing that the Constitution means what it says, that the rights enumerated in the founding documents are real and enforceable, and that the court should not manufacture new rights from the bench that the text does not support. He was dismissed. He was ridiculed. His colleagues didn't join his opinion for years. Then the court changed, and one by one, the lone dissenters became the majority. Bruin, the Second Amendment case that transformed gun right laws. Dobbs, which returned abortion law to the states and the people. Affirmative action, which was overturned by an originalist court. That is what principled conviction looks like over 34 years. That is what originalism is built on. And I'm Jenny Beth Martin. That is your Constitution Minute. As we close today, I'd like to just take a moment and acknowledge Ted Turner, who is an icon in my hometown of Atlanta. Now, I didn't agree with him politically, but I have always respected the businessman he was and the impact he made on Atlanta and its place not only in America, but in the world. As a child, I grew up watching Turner Broadcasting System and later CNN. I loved America's team. And for those of you who don't know, that is the Atlanta Braves, which Ted Turner owned and shared with the entire country on TBS. I'm praying for his family and his friends during their time of mourning. Now, please make sure you call your senators and tell them to pass the Save America Act. Remember, the Capitol switchboard number is 202-224-3121. For more information, you can go to passthesaveamericaact.com. I'm Jenny Beth Martin. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and God bless America. If you enjoyed today's conversation, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people who care about liberty and the Constitution. You can find this and other episodes at jennybethshow.com, as well as Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, Instagram, X, and your favorite podcast platform.
The Jenny Beth Show is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin. The Jenny Beth Show is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org.